Hi everyone. By this point in semester, you'll be aware that of course there is a group assignment. You'll be familiar with the key requirements of that group assignment from reading the group assignment brief and perhaps even the group assignment rubrics that we'll be using to mark your group assignment. You'll have chosen a product that you're working on with your teams and probably in the midst of researching at the moment. So what I'm going to do in this video is offer you a bit more specific guidance by showing you an example from a past semester and talking you through what the team did really well, what we look for when we're looking at a poster like this or a video or an infographic, whichever one you choose, and talking about some of the things they might have done better as well. I'll also post these as resources alongside this video so you can have a closer look in your own time. And of course, if you do have any specific questions that arise out of watching this and in relation to your own assignment, feel free to shoot me an email or post a question on a discussion forum. Okay, so this particular group, Team Herbie, decided to analyze a Volkswagen car. And that was in the wake of the emissions scandal at that stage. So there's a lot of nice material for them to go through. Now, the first thing I notice just looking at this poster overall is that it's quite well organized. There's a clear structure, so they've numbered all the different sections and the flow in which they want the reader to go through. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 big sections and clearly marked flow throughout. Good use of visuals and quite nicely structured visually as well. So that's part of your visual presentations and part of the structure of that assignment. And I noticed what they've done here in terms of their structure is that they've essentially used the 6 parts of the group assignment brief and use that as a general guide in terms of how they organize their final product. So if we look back onto the brief, the first part of the brief asks you to choose the product and then conduct a literature review on the background of the product's overall market and broader social context, and then to conduct the story of stuff analysis. And that's essentially what they've done in this top half or this top third of this poster. So here's the product and a lit review in this section, which you can read in the attachment. They've visually presented a story of stuff analysis covering some key facts from extraction to disposal of the product. And then finally, they've distilled some of the key social issues that arise out of that story of stuff analysis that they've conducted. So it's essentially a very nice way of setting the scene in a very concrete and well-researched manner. Now, second to that, if we go back into the brief, the second piece of instruction is to go through the 7 steps of the ethical analysis protocol and using that as a guideline to talk about some of the key marketing and society issues which arise from the purchase of the product. And it's about elaborating those and discussing it more fully there. And also to remember to specify strategic alternatives and frame the analysis using at least one ethical theory. So that's how they've structured this here. So this section 5 here, it's basically they're going through the 7 steps of the ethical analysis protocol as well. Now, they also needed to clearly frame your argument in a macro marketing or a critical marketing perspective. In this particular instance, they've chosen the macro marketing perspective, and rather than setting it up as a separate section, they've interspersed it within their literature review. And also, if we zoom in here to key social issues, they've adopted the macro marketing approach there as well. So that's an acceptable way of doing it. You can use that brief as a general guide rather than a prescriptive guide, if that makes sense. And so moving on to step 4 of the brief, the instruction is: imagine you work for an organization which specializes in providing CSR advice to organizations. And you're planning a major product overall. What advice would you give to the manufacturer of the product? So that's where they cover the industry perspective. And then question 5 of the brief asks about policy recommendations for governments and policy makers. So that's there's section 7 here. And then the final part of the brief asks you to reflect on some key marketing and society lessons that you've learned from this project, and that's where they address that here. So overall, this was really well structured in terms of they used the brief as a general guide and sort of expanded on that, and there was a very strong logical flow addressing all parts of the brief there. Okay, so that's the first thing I look for, which is, did you address all key parts of the brief and how well structured, how visually appealing is the presentation? The next thing I look for when I'm evaluating these assignments is connection to theory. And there's a couple of key theoretical frameworks or theoretical spaces that you do need to be engaging in. One is that space of macro marketing or critical marketing, so one of the two. And if we look here, this group has engaged reasonably well with a macro marketing approach, so they've identified it for the first bit, but also integrated into their literature review. They talked about 2 separate schools of thought in the automotive industry about how the industry will move towards low emissions vehicles, and that map onto the 2 schools of thought in macro marketing. So it's nice how they integrated their research on the industry itself and the philosophy and the direction of the industry with the theoretical perspectives we covered in macro marketing. So you will be familiar with macro marketing in week 2 or critical marketing in week 3. So you do need to integrate your analysis back with those theoretical frameworks, at the very least, briefly. The other theoretical framework you do need to engage in is with the ethical theories that we covered as part of week 4 from memory, which is the 7-step ethical analysis protocol. And the big part of that really is the selection of ethical theory. This group mentions an ethical theory, but they could have done a lot more in terms of explaining why they chose that particular ethical theory, how it frames the decisions and their recommendations. So a lot more depth could have gone into that particular part there, considering all you've learned around ethical theory previously. So do make sure you're engaging with those different types of theories. At least one is a minimum, but in order to really develop this argument a little bit further, you do need to consider the decisions you're making from at least 2 different ethical theories there. And go back into your week 4 discussions to think about how you would frame that. So remember, we talked about the Starbucks case as an example there, and how do they make ethical pricing decisions, and how do you frame that from at least 2 different schools, ethical theories there. So that's an example of how you would apply that with respect to your group assignment. Okay, so that's the second thing I look at, which is the strength of the connection to theory, macro marketing / critical marketing, and ethical theories, which we've learned about in the first 4 weeks. The next thing I look at is how well the presentation, the poster, the infographic, the video helps to answer the following question. What are the strategic options? What do we do going forward? What is the best decision? This ethical analysis isn't just about analyzing a market, describing a market, calling attention to the problems. It's about recommending, identifying, first of all, strategic options, and then recommending the best option, most recommended option, so that you can actually tell your manager, your marketers, what they should do going forward. So it's not about just describe the market. That's an important first step, but it's about framing an understanding of the market and using that to make a decision about what do we do next. So this team has done reasonably well in terms of making specific recommendations for both the managers of Volkswagen and policymakers within the auto industry space as well. So if we look at their strategic ethical analysis, the 7-step protocol here, that's where that decision making and the alternatives spotting comes in. So in step 5, they've outlined some alternatives. So one thing you can do is do nothing. What's an alternative to that? What's another alternative to that? So be able to specify at least 3 or 4 or 5 different strategic options for go forward. And then number 6 is when you identify which of these do you think is the best go forward strategy and why. And then finally, monitoring the decision outcome. How do you put a structure in place to make sure that there's a level of transparency and accountability there? And they've also gone beyond the 7-step protocol into the next couple of bits where they make recommendations for, in this part, the industry players, Volkswagen and other industry players as well, and also policy makers. So have a look at that. And that's something to keep in mind as you go into the next few stages of your assignment and as you have your discussions, which is how well are we answering the what do we do next question, and how well are we answering that from the manufacturer's perspective, but also from government/policy perspective. Now, the final thing I look at is depth of research. How well has the group done their homework? How much do they know about that particular sector? And how well have they drawn on a variety of sources to support their argument? So that's where your reference list comes in. The reference list can be as long as you like because that doesn't count toward your word limit. So do make sure you include the reference list somewhere. If you're submitting a video, you could include it as your last sort of credit slide, for instance. So make sure it's somewhere there as part of your assignment. But here's, if you look through this reference list, they have done a lot of work, that's for sure. But also the variety of sources is interesting because there's a variety of things like journal articles, such as this one. They've drawn on some of the assigned readings, and of course you're more than encouraged to do that. They've drawn on some credible press statements as well as other industry reports. I'm trying to find out. Industry reports here. So through this variety of sources, they've been able to really distill some key facts about the industry in their analysis and boil it down to what they wanted to present in that poster. And they were also able to identify really at quite a specific level some of the key stakeholders who they needed to be involved and give specific examples of some key stakeholders which needed to be involved. So for example, when they were recommending for industry actors to partner with regulatory and industry bodies, they were then able to give an example of a key actor within that space. Here they could have given a more specific example about a local environmental protection body in Australia that would have been an appropriate partner for Volkswagen going forward. So really that depth of research, doing your homework gives you a lot of knowledge about that particular industry and helps you identify some key stakeholders. So I will be looking at how specific you get in your analysis and in your recommendations and the kind of fources you draw on and the variety of those sources you draw on in your research. So to summarize, there are four main questions I ask myself when I'm looking at a team project. The first is, does it address all key parts of the brief? Is it structured well? Is it visually well presented? So that initial structure and visual presentation and making sure all the parts of the brief are covered. That's the first theme. The second is connection to theory. So how well is it connected to either macro marketing or critical marketing, as well as linked to ethical theories, which we covered under your strategic ethical analysis. The other thing is depth of research. So have they used a variety of good sources, good credible sources? Have they distilled them? Have they identified specific stakeholders as a result of their research? And finally, how well does the project address the all-important question, both for marketers and for policymakers? what should we do next? Have they identified the strategic options, the strategic alternatives, and justified why they think their recommended option is the best way forward? So again, it's all about helping managers and policymakers make good decisions with an appropriate ethical frame. So those are the key things I'm looking for. Hopefully, having seen a specific example from a past semester, you'll have a better idea of some of the possible ways in which you might structure your own presentation and some key questions to think about as you're doing your research and framing your particular argument. Now, if you have any specific questions, I do encourage you to get in touch with me either by email or by discussion forum, and I'll post these as well for you to have a look at.